Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education or an interview with a guest or multiple guests. In this week's episode, I'm speaking with Charlotte Dungan, where we discuss Charlotte's holistic approach to education, remotely teaching computer science to rural communities before COVID and after, why Charlotte believes teaching is harder than working in industry, teaching AI in elementary school, the influence of money on research and practice, the future of work, and so much more. If you want to find podcasts similar to this one or some resources that were mentioned, like some of the websites that Charlotte mentioned, make sure you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. On my website, you'll find a ton of computer science education resources, as well as a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that powers this podcast and the nonprofit that I work for. You'll also find a bunch of gaming and drumming content because I'm a nerd and I like to stream and create content in my leisure, not just for my day job. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Dungan. I am currently Director of Implementation at AIEDU. That's the AI Education Project. We are interested in ensuring that everyone has access to AI education. And prior to working at AIEDU, I have worked all the way through from pre-K all the way to adult education, and have been very fortunate to both be a computer programmer and teach computer science throughout the grade span. And I went to Harvard University for a degree in learning and teaching, and I've been really fortunate to have learned some great theory and constructionism through Karen Brennan, and she has done work with MIT, and all the Scratch that you've seen is through them too. So I feel like I blend a great amount of theory and practice and the actual real world of coding, having been a database developer and web developer for about 10 years. And so here I am now talking to you about AI education in the K-8 space.
So can you tell me the story of how you went from being a developer to working in computer science education?
Sure. So I really liked what I did, actually. I loved developing databases in particular, making sure they were secure. And then I had a baby, and then I had another baby. And as I was looking around with these 3 and 1 year old, I was like, I don't actually see a school that I'm really excited to send them to. And why is that? I wanted them to have a really hands-on, child-led, adult-guided approach to education. I wanted them to have opportunities to explore at their own pace, whether that be faster or slower than what is the average. And so I went back and I got a teaching degree. I actually have concentrations in English and history in K-12, and I taught at a small alternative elementary school in Ohio called the Antioch School. I was just a teaching assistant when I started, and I worked in the pre-K classroom, and I learned there how to observe children and really delve deeply into how they learn, and they learn by play. And I was really grateful to have started my education as an adult learner there. And then from there, I just expanded out, but it was really wanting something different for my own kids and then building it.
How did you know that that approach was what you preferred? And I ask this because most of my experience in education was not that. But the few times that I actually had that hands-on, interest-driven approach, it just worked so well, but it was the minority of my experiences. So how did you know that that would work great for your kids when the pervasive approach is not that?
I think I was very influenced, having grown up in an inner city context with single parent. My mom worked at a grocery store. She was a bagger. She was disabled, so she had very limited opportunities. Had a series of stepdads, and the one that I consider dad, he didn't know how to read. And so although I was occasionally labeled gifted, I was also bounced through the system up and down, extra opportunities, no opportunities. And I really wanted to make sure that my best experiences, the ones where I had a summer camp where I got to delve into math and actually build something that was related to math, or those really inspiring teachers that I had, I wanted them to not bounce around. I wanted my own kids to not bounce around. But I also knew that the way that people learn best is actually by doing. And I don't see schools having the resources always to do that. I think there are lots of really good people who want to do what they can for kids, but they have a lot of constraints. And so I was looking for how I could, paddle a different kind of boat. And I feel like public education in America is a very big cruise ship. And I had one tiny, tiny oar. And so I wanted to figure out how I could maybe make a smaller boat in a better direction. And also not forgetting that there are kids who don't have access to all kinds of resources, right? Like I knew that I didn't have opportunities and options as a kid, but I wanted that to be true for more kids, that they would have more opportunities and options, whether or not they came from a family that had ability to provide those.
One of the things I've been fascinated with when interviewing different guests is kind of hearing how what they thought when they started with education might differ from what they view right now. So when the things that I believed and understood when I first went and started teaching, like my senior year of high school, is very different than I believe now. So I'm curious for you, like what's something that you believed when you first began working in education that you no longer believe?
The first week that I started teaching high school computer science, I had a teacher tell me, because I will only teach these students one semester, there's no way that you can change a life. Like that's far too aspirational. You may be able to impart some knowledge, but don't aim for that great thing of changing someone's life. And that teacher was wrong. You have great power and responsibility to mentor the students that you encounter. And the ones who are changed forever, they may not be the ones that you expect when they walk in the door, but you do have that power in one semester, in one computer science class to fundamentally alter what kids believe is possible for themselves. I'm glad that that's shifted for me, that I didn't listen to that teacher and then I held on to that idealism because I think it's still true.
I wonder what the catalyst was for them to believe that. Just me kind of thinking out loud, because I am here today. I am alive today because of good educators I've had in my life. Having been suicidal and chronic depression and whatnot, like music and the music educators in my lives is literally the reason why I'm alive today. So that's something that has obviously had a profound impact on myself. So it's something that I've been aware of as well. Like sometimes you don't even realize how much of an impact you're having on students. And then a few years down the road, when you've no longer worked with them, they'll come back and be like, hey, you had a profound impact on my life. And you might not have even realized it in the moment.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's one of the best reasons to work in education, is to be that for someone else when they were that for you.
Yeah. So one really interesting things that we had talked about previously prior to recording this was you had talked about how you kind of worked with a variety of different schools and rural contexts and whatnot. So I'm curious, like, could you explain what that is and like how you were able to provide CS education to so many different rural schools?
Sure. So I am in North Carolina, and North Carolina has a school called the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics. It is a public residential high school that also has an online program where students in 11th and 12th grade apply to attend, and they are typically the highest performing students in their region. So if you're from a great metropolis, you're not competing with someone who's in the farm area. They are divided up by congressional district and they try to keep it really fair. Everybody gets an equal number of slots. So in addition to the application process, NCSSM, the school, offers a program that they call open enrollment. And that is where a school can identify a student who is not joining the 11th and 12th grade program to have enrichment courses. And those are taught by NCSSM faculty. So I was hired not only to teach computer science, which I did, but to create a program called STEM Scholars. And that was to better prepare students in 9th and 10th grade to have computer science and other high-level courses. So they always took computer science, and then they were offered other higher level, might be a math enrichment or a science enrichment course, so that they had more opportunities to shine prior to applying to NCSSM. So these were schools that were targeted specifically for being very rural, Title I. Often they were really small, like the whole 10th grade might have 35 or 40 students. And sometimes they were larger, but the factor was always that they either didn't have the expertise to teach higher level courses, electives. They always had great core subject teachers, but they didn't either have someone who could do that, or maybe they only had one or two students who actually would enroll in a course that was outside of the norm. And so when you aggregate those kids and you put them in, we had a TV studio, think of it like Zoom before Zoom was a thing. Like they would sign in to a system that had high-speed internet in their school, even if it wasn't available in their community. And they were able to access a teacher like me, or there were many others, who could provide an experience that they wouldn't otherwise have. And in addition to teaching remotely, once per semester, we had the great opportunity to visit. And that was really the magic, to see where they're from, their context. And it's very different at the coast, in the mountains, whether or not they're farmers or, in a manufacturing area. And so I really got to know my state very well, and the opportunities and challenges that differ across the regions. Not only did I teach them for a semester, but I continued to mentor most of those kids throughout high school. That was like the best part, was to bring them CS, but also bring them many more opportunities, where we had an opportunity to do a cybersecurity club, and they were able to participate remotely. And we helped some of them to do the Congressional App Challenge. And that was all done remotely because we already had the connection. So we just continued that informally in many cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you were doing that before remote learning was mandated because of COVID and whatnot.
Can I talk about that just a minute? Because I did teach also through the pandemic, and it was such a different and disheartening experience. I feel like we have perhaps missed the boat on what remote learning could be because we did it in a crisis. And now everyone has an impression of the negatives of it. For example, teaching my remote students in rural areas at home, they didn't have the bandwidth to turn on their camera. They might not have a device that was as robust as they might have at school. And often they were watching their siblings.
Yep.
When we tried to develop projects for the communities, they had limitations like, I only stay at home. I'm literally not leaving. So I hope that people who are listening, who may have had a negative online experience or virtual experience, come to understand that the emergency situation is not the reality of what that experience can be.
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about remote instruction and whatnot. I feel like we have been presented an opportunity to rethink and kind of reset some things in education, and I don't necessarily feel like we have taken advantage of that opportunity to go, hey, why are we doing some of the things that we're doing that might not be best for students in the long run? Because a lot of teachers are back in the classroom, and it's just, let's go back to business as usual, what it was before the pandemic, as opposed to thinking of what worked well with remote learning, what didn't work well, and then before the pandemic, what did and did not work well in the classroom. What should we change?
Yeah, and what tools were really effective to reach different types of kids, and being able to differentiate, use multiple tools to teach the same content. I love multiple access points for the same idea. You catch more kids that way.
Yeah, because for some people, the remote learning was better than in person, and then vice versa. So we got to figure out why, and then how could we have those different access points for different students.
Yeah. And previous to COVID, when they were learning with me, they were learning remotely in their school. So all of the social benefits were still there. They were supported often by either someone in their media center or an instructor in a classroom. And that's quite different than an online class where they're still very much being self-driven. I was teaching them in person every day.
One of the things that you mentioned in a prior conversation was you have a holistic approach to education. And I'm curious, could you describe what that is and then how that informs your approach with working with students?
Every student, every person is a unique individual who wants to succeed, who has their own unique goals and interests and strengths and weaknesses. And if we can create content that allows them to use those strengths to tap into those areas of interest, I want to talk about Desi's self-determination theory and how important it is, I think, is in the classroom. It has 3 parts: autonomy, competence, and connection. And those 3 things are really important, whether or not you have a kid who might be interested in your subject or forced to take your subject. When you can give people autonomy and they feel some control of their own experience and their own projects, for example, that makes them feel more connected to the course material or to you as the instructor, and that they want to feel competent. So as they gain mastery, I teach them how to fail. Actually, iteration isn't something we talk about, that even if they make something great the first time or they come in very well prepared, because in computer science, I'll get kids who have been doing camps for 5 years, with their very, very well-resourced parents. And then someone who's never even heard of coding and they've signed up to be brave. And so we actually start with an activity where students who are very successful are expected to add to their skill set, and students who have never touched a computer before, the competence is actually the trying. Like just by trying, you pass that first assignment, just by being vulnerable. And so by reaching people with a level where they can feel competent at the start, that gives them a feeling of that they can master tasks, and then they take on additional challenges, especially when the price of failure is almost none, when you're actually required to push your limits. And then finally, like the connection or relatedness piece is how students feel like they belong in a class, that they have peers who are perhaps like them in some way, and that they have a relationship that's positive with the instructor. I think self-determination theory and also constructionism are probably the two theories that I use most, because they leave agency to the individual. And then constructionism is where they actually build their own learning. So as much as I can possible, I do project-based learning. By doing that, I know we're going back to the whole child. Like we're thinking about them as individuals. And so they have freedom to create projects that are relevant and interesting and important to them, as long as they meet some specific objectives and they get very, very creative. And that creativity is also like extremely motivating. So the whole child is that you don't forget their context, you don't forget their culture, you don't forget the fact that they have other classes. Like one of the nicest projects a student ever did for me, he almost didn't do it all. And he came to me and said, I just have another project that I have to do for a class. And I said, well, we'll just move your presentation to next Monday. And he said, you would do that for me? Well, of course we would, because that'll get your best work, right? And so there we go, the whole child.
How did you cultivate the connectedness or relatedness even in remote contexts?
I bring in visitors that are relevant to them, and I do it a lot. So I have a colleague at SCAD, the South Carolina Design School, and we created this class called Connected Computing, and it was with a partnership with the North Carolina Zoo. And the concept is the San Diego Zoo Global Initiative was looking at how empathy is actually really important for people to make a change environmentally. You actually have to care about the animals. You can't just like abstractly visit the animals or like hope that the environment stays better. You actually have to like care that kangaroos or giraffes or lizards are impacted by your behavior. And so thinking about some of the technologies that they built, like butterfly wings, where you can feel the magnetic pull of the earth. We built these same types of projects. The students built like robotic turtles that you could drive. And one boy built an earpiece that you put over your ears. In North Carolina, we have red wolves that are endangered. And you might think that their best sense is smell, but it's actually hearing. They can hear up to 6 miles. And so at the zoo, you could like navigate with your sense of hearing using his app as you wore the earphones. And so when I was in this one particular school, it was hard for those students to connect to like what all this technology has to do with where they live. And like they like hunting and fishing, right? And so why would we want to save the turtles when we want to catch the turtles? And so this professor from SCAD came and he does VR experiences that are related to nature. And he talked to them about growing up and hunting turtles, and how great it was that when he went to college, he didn't have to give up his culture. He actually integrated it in some of the other experiences. And he was a better person and richer for having had the experiences that he did growing up. And so that's it to me, is like, I connected all those things that seem quite disparate. Like we got zoo and computer science and like technology and this media guy and these kids. And you just look for those connections, and it's different for each kid, but you find the connection, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I appreciate that last point. Far too often, an approach that's used is usually aiming for the median or the average in a classroom. And let's just teach to a collective rather than to a collection of individuals who have unique individualized needs, interests, goals, passions, etc. And I fully recognize how hard that is, having worked with thousands of students over the years, but that's like the thing that we should really strive for. But I mean, I guess speaking of that, like one of the things that you had mentioned in a prior conversation was that you felt like education was harder than working as a programmer. So I'm curious what makes you say that.
Being an educator is harder than being a programmer, because if you solve a problem, it just works, right? But people don't work that way. And to me, education is people. So we can't always solve the problems that we see in kids' lives. We can only just do one small piece. There's some great examples of people who are doing good work to support kids where they are. And I want to share this story about an educator who is in a community where for generations, the families have lived in the same place. So it's not expected that you would leave. It's not expected that you would try to go to college, for example. And so she created a college pathway where students are able to gain all the credits that they need to be successful in going to college with a career certificate program. So while students are receiving a credential that they could use to have a job in their community, they're also, if they choose to, ready to go out into the work world. That's a lot harder to dream up than to like figure out a database, right?
Yeah.
And when you're a teacher, when you're invested in those kids, you're constantly problem solving, like every day. That's what you do. So of course it's easier.
Why is education so important to you? Like to shift careers to work in education when you're probably making significantly less than you were as a developer. Like that for many people is a hard shift to make. It is a very difficult field, but why is education important for you?
First, like to acknowledge that I had the opportunity to switch because I had privilege with a partner who was stable, with a good job. So when I did take that financial hit, it was because I had a partner who could support me, and not everyone can choose to make a switch like I did. So acknowledging that privilege, it's so critical for what I hope to see in the world. I worked with nonprofits as a computer programmer. I developed good programs that helped people indirectly through programming, but it's so satisfying to actually invest in people. It's such a part of me that I don't know how to get away with it. It just fills my bucket in a way that just being a computer science developer didn't or couldn't.
Does that relate to your understanding of education as being an equalizer?
Yes. I don't think the only path to success is college. I think it's a great path to success for many people. But I do know that love of learning is the most critical thing that we can give to kids. If they know that they can learn something themselves, that they're empowered to embrace learning challenges. Equity is a funny thing. Like it does mean that you give some people more, or that you have to invest in some people more to get a similar outcome. So my work now in AI education is to think about that equity gap of who's getting computer science, who's getting advanced technologies like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, data science. And it's often kids who opt in or kids who have been encouraged by their families. And so the work that I'm doing at AIEDU is to make sure that we reach the communities that would otherwise not stumble into those opportunities. So it's quite intentional. My work in education is equity driven, and it's often with partners, partner schools, partner districts, partner organizations informally also, like museums and Boys and Girls Club, for example. I've been a longtime Girl Scout leader, and I'm really excited about some of the opportunities they have. And like the reason those organizations are so important is because otherwise you're not reaching every community, every kid. And every kid deserves computer science, especially if they're not identified as gifted. You know, if they're identified in other ways, they still deserve to know how technology is impacting their life, because it does.
So you mentioned AI. I'm curious if we could like double click on that topic in particular. So when I think of AI or hear people talking about it, it's usually talking about at the high school or collegiate level. But when you speak about AI, you've also done it in like the K-5 setting. So I'm curious, could you describe what that might look like? Like if somebody were to walk into you teaching an AI class or lesson, like what might people be learning or doing in that kind of class?
Sure. I'm going to start with AIforK12.org. They are an organization with multiple university partners and teachers, K to 12, who came together to work on national guidelines for AI education. AI meaning artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is a set of technologies. You don't think just robot, although there may be AI and robots. It's like a way for a computer system to learn using data and sensory input to perform a task that a human has specified. So robots aren't alive. They're not coming to get you. They're only as good or as bad as the people who program them and decide what they should do. So we can improve them. And these technologies are all around us. And so this organization, AI for K-12, came together, and I was on the working group, first at the K-2 grade band and then at the 6-8 grade band, to think about what students should know and be able to do in AI education. And it's such a cool topic. So we broke it down into 5 big ideas. And the first is sensors and perception. Sensors are things like microphones and cameras that allow machines to perceive the world like people do, like a camera can see, a microphone can hear, but they can also do things that we can't do, like look out into the sky using a telescope or look down into something smaller than our eyes can see with a microscope and gather information that we can use. They can also hear at frequencies that we can't hear, for example. So sensors gather data. Perception allows us to understand that data, and we can use a computer program usually to see that information in a way that works for our eyes, for example. Then we have representation and reasoning, the second big idea. Representation is how we represent that information in some meaningful way and how we can perform reasoning on it. So for example, we can look at galaxies. I guess we're going on a space theme today. And we can identify using a computer program what a galaxy looks like. Maybe it has a spiral shape, and that spiral shape is represented by some pixels on a screen that we can see with our eyes and a computer program can recognize too. And we can perform reasoning on that to identify whether the spiral goes left or it goes right. And this is actually an activity that you can do with NASA for free. You can see the images that come back from the telescopes and you can identify galaxy shapes, and then you can actually help a computer learn to identify them, so that when we take billions and billions of pictures with the James Webb Space Telescope, AI can help us sort all that data. So we have sensors and perception, then we perform representation and reasoning, and then we have natural interaction. And this is how we interact with our AI computer systems. Maybe that's with a screen, maybe it's with a microphone, but it's how our technologies blend seamlessly into our lives. And so this is becoming more and more a thing as Google Home or Alexa or Siri become a part of our lives. Natural interaction is how translation works. Like if we say something in English and we want it to say out loud to someone else in Spanish, translation, we want that to be as natural as possible. And we want that technology to work for as many people as possible. So if you have a 5-year-old voice, maybe you don't say all of your letters, consonant sounds exactly right. Can the device still understand you? Or if you've had a stroke, for example, does your technology still work for you? Can all people interact naturally with the technology? This only happens when computer systems learn from data. And we're talking about enormous amounts of data, lots and lots and lots of information. The more information we give, the better the computer system can do at giving us the results that we expect. So if we only have adults speak to computer systems, they probably won't work very well for children. But if we get a lot of children to talk to those devices also, and we can improve over time, then the computer systems do a better job. This is also true for issues that you may have heard of regarding bias in computer systems or problems, perhaps ethical concerns about AI. But the reality is that AI can be both positive and negative, and the ethical impacts, they can be just as good as people want them to be. So for example, a positive impact of AI is that we may not have a single person making a decision that could be biased or racist. And also, like, we can actually process many more images for breast cancer detection, for example, by using a computer algorithm to save the resources of the researcher who's looking at each individual slide. If we can definitely eliminate some of those cells that look completely normal, then we can save the human resources for those maybe questionable or potentially cancerous identifications. There's positives, there's negatives. Negatives could be, wow, we didn't train our algorithm to look for wedding photos except for American wedding photos. And so when we Google the word wedding and we're from another culture, it may not identify weddings correctly. And so sometimes there's gender bias or racial bias. But one thing that makes me hopeful about AI is that because those biases are external, we can evaluate them externally. We're not judging me as the programmer for making a decision. We're just able to improve data and measure it over time. And so I think AI, although there is possibility of problems or bias, could be a really positive thing for society. So getting back to how do you teach all that to a 5-year-old, there's a great program called Teachable Machine. And with this program, without any reading or writing at all, you can record yourself and you can identify a marker with one set of images, and you can identify a Lego figure with another set of images, and you can train the machine to learn the difference, even if you turn the Lego upside down or zoom it way far out or way far in. And so we can teach kids really early about these 5 ideas, giving some of the examples I just gave you.
What recommendations do you have for an educator who's like, hey, this sounds awesome. I'm definitely going to go to AI4K12.org, but I also want to learn more about AI in the K-5 or even older grade levels?
Yeah, well, K-5, I recommend CS is elementary. I'm the teacher for AI, but they have other classes too. They have cybersecurity and beginning programming. But the great thing about them is you don't have to know anything at all except how to play a video to your class, and students can follow along and do the work, and you can learn right alongside them. So if you do the free program, you can learn all about AI education. You got about 2 weeks of content, 10 days. You can learn it too, though, and then you can teach it however you want. You can modify it, which is really great. And then right now I work on curriculum and resources for 8th to 12th grade at AIEDU. We also have free curriculum with all the supports that a teacher might need, including we have help sessions and training for teachers who would like to get support in diving in. So don't feel too intimidated. It's really exciting to bring AI to your classroom.
How do you respond to people who see like more frameworks or standards or subject areas being added to the plate and fearing that it's diluting everything that's already also there? Or like, hey, 10 years from now, we're going to have even more that keeps adding, then this is going to dilute what we're currently adding.
I hope that we see transformation over time in the way we teach our core subjects. I think reading for a long, long time is going to remain reading, but math in particular, computerbasedmaths.org is from the founder of Mathematica, Conrad Wolfram, and he's really interested in acknowledging that every person who perhaps isn't limited by someone telling them they can't have a device has a computer. They have a phone, they have a computer, they have a tablet, they have these at school, and yet we often take them out of the math classroom.
Yeah.
And so it's exciting to me to think about how instead of further differentiating and separating out our subjects, we actually begin integrating and overlapping technologies that better prepare students for the future of work. So group work and assignments that cross domains. I think data science is another place where we're seeing that in the science classroom. It's like really, really exciting to see integration of technology. And so I think of AI as part of a larger CS umbrella where I hope to see more and more. For one example, I know a teacher who teaches English language arts in high school, and she teaches Shakespeare like many teachers do. And she has students, instead of blocking the play, traditionally they use robots that she controls remotely. So they don't have to have a robot for every student. They use little bird robots, finch robots. She's using coding as a way to think about plays in the 21st century.
So what do you feel is holding back educators of the field, and what's something we can do about that?
In certain states, there are no structures for teaching computer science, or those structures are not adequate to actually get a class with every student included to have a computer science experience. I think also there's a lot of fear for teachers who have obligations to meet certain testing or standards requirements, and they don't necessarily feel like this extra thing is worth the risk. I think it's a fear issue almost. Like teachers truly have to take a risk and sometimes learn alongside their students. I hope that if you're listening to this, that you'll be brave and think of yourself less as a sage on the stage and more of a guide on the side where you can explore things together. And kids naturally love technology anyway. So it's a great way to delve in.
So if somebody is brand new to CS, maybe they've been teaching for a while and they are interested in diving in and learning alongside kids, but they also want to improve upon their abilities over time. So it's not just like constantly going, well, I don't know, let's figure it out. I'm curious if you could share like how you practice and iterate on your own abilities, either in computer science or in education, and maybe your response would help somebody else who's interested in doing something similar.
Sure. I think in terms of computer science specifically, it is worthwhile to join CSTA, find your local chapter, meet with other educators who are also implementing CS, and try to go to the national conference if you can. Find somebody who will fund you to go so that you can have the opportunity to learn a lot all at once. Remain curious. Go ahead and just get on Scratch and make a silly game. It's really scary to do that, but use the tutorials that are built for children. I'm going to confess something here. I often learn a new skill, any new skill, cooking, weaving, or whatever. I go to the youth section of the library and I pick out a book that's designed for fifth graders, and it hits me where I'm at. I'm not going to learn to knit from an adult book, but I am going to learn to knit from a book written for fifth graders. That's my superpower.
I often just pull up YouTube. How do I figure out how to do this thing? Just type the question into YouTube. All right, let's watch a few videos.
That's true. And Coding Train, I have to give a shout out to Coding Train. They do such a good job of breaking down even AI videos, but any kind of Python you want to do, get on the Coding Train because they're going to show you exactly how to do it.
How do you prevent the burnout that can come with constantly iterating and improving things and just working in the field of education, which is known for having a high dropout rate?
It's hard. If you're at that point right now, you might look around and think it's not worth it. And it's okay if it isn't. It's okay to protect yourself, to take care of yourself. I think it's really important to take time and break in the summer to actually recharge and not do every PD offered, every, summer camp available to you. It's not worth the little bit of money to take on that second job if you can't come back restored and refreshed. I think we need to do a better job as a society in supporting educators and recognizing what enormously hard work they have been doing over the last several years and how many people are leaving the field, especially really thoughtful, dedicated educators who just can't do it anymore. And we can't continue to ask teachers to give up their planning periods to cover for other teachers. Teaching is the only field I know where you have to bring your own whiteboard markers to the classroom to teach a class. And so unless we fix things systemically, we're not going to see the best educators. They may choose to leave because it's too hard. And I don't think that's wrong. But if you want to stay, the best way to do it is to continue to fall in love with your students and your subject. Seek out a great administration. It's okay to go to the district next door and take care of yourself. Maybe that isn't the answer I was supposed to say, but that's what I feel is true, is like until we as a society take care of educators, we're going to continue to see turnover.
Yeah. Are there systems that you put into place to try and help yourself? Like I really appreciate it, and that last point resonates with me. Like I was in a district where it wasn't great, and then I moved to a different district and it was awesome. So like just having a change of admin and environments can have a profound impact on like my own personal well-being and whatnot.
Oh, yeah. I do think it's important to continue learning independently. I think in the classroom, though, we can also set the bar a little bit lower. I think formative assessment is really useful as a tool to take the pressure off for you personally as a teacher, to have like a quick reflection piece where you can see where they're at, but you don't have to grade every darn thing. I think using some tools like peer assessment in assessment of projects and having like really clear rubrics that students can self-evaluate and having like clear endpoints where a project is showcased, for example. And if you meet all the requirements of the showcase, well, then you know what your grade is. And taking some of that pressure off yourself, it's also okay to set some really clear boundaries. Like, I don't work on Sundays. I don't grade. I go mountain biking. That's what I do. And having those boundaries does not make you a bad teacher, even if it means you didn't finish a certain thing that you were supposed to get done. So focusing on what matters. I have the like 2x2 in my brain of like make 4 squares, important and urgent. And really you only need to do the things that are important and urgent. And the other things can wait. And that as long as your students are in the important plus urgent bucket, the fact that you graded something or didn't this weekend probably doesn't matter.
I really appreciate that response. I have heard similar things in some sessions before, and people have said that they felt like they needed the permission to do that. They needed to hear that from somebody. So hopefully there's a listener out there who listened to that and is like, yes, this just resonated really well with them.
Try to remain in the work. It's what you're doing is really important. You matter to kids. You're giving them opportunities they might not otherwise have, but you don't have to sacrifice yourself.
Snaps to that. What do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
I wish that researchers who come into classrooms were thinking about the students and the teachers first, not their PhD project, not the outcomes of a survey, but the actual experience that students have with your activity. If you're starting with a pre-survey and you end with a post-survey, what did the student gain from that survey? I'm guessing nothing. So why don't you redesign that survey to be a formative assessment that students can reflect on their own work, and you can evaluate the responses of that to get at the data that you need. And otherwise, pay your teacher to spend the time that they have with you and ensure that the lesson that you're building, that you're testing in their classroom, is aligned to the other work that they're doing. And I see often a disrespect from researchers who work with teachers that the primary goal is the research, and it's not. It's the student experience.
Yeah, I had a meeting a couple hours before recording this episode that was talking about future grant proposals with some other researchers and whatnot. And part of the meeting was like, hey, let's pull up the request and let's see what the verbiage says. And a lot of the verbiage in there is it's talking about like effective teaching practices. It's not necessarily trying to improve, but rather just prove what works. So the grants that fund a lot of this research that will give hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, often has a huge influence on the kinds of questions that researchers ask. So I think if we were to do that, which I agree with, we have to also look the step above the researchers at like what's funding that research.
I probably have a bias there because I am pretty familiar with AI grants right now.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of money going into how we might best do artificial intelligence education. And those are not only centered on teaching students or teaching teachers to teach AI, but also on what tools we might empower teachers with so that they can use AI and apply it to their classrooms. Like, how could we better personalize education? So as all of that rolls out, just keeping in mind always the experience of the teacher and the student, respecting the teacher as the expert in the room is really important. There's always going to be those other poles. I think there's better partnerships to be had in those spaces.
Yeah, RPP work, research practitioner partnerships, tend to elevate the role of educators within that research space. But I definitely see this like hierarchy where the research and the research question and the person who's evaluating that is often positioned above the teachers as having more power and sway and whatnot. So it is interesting seeing the shift where they're trying to have teachers have a voice and have a say in like the questions that are being asked and how it's being implemented and whatnot, but there's still not enough of that.
Yeah, I think probably I'm influenced by how I learned in my very first school, which was I didn't come in as the expert. I came in as the learner. I hope researchers come in with an eye to surprise what might come out of this with just a little bit of open mind. It's exciting.
Yeah, I like that. A lot of the researchers that I'll interview, I'll ask a question like, what has surprised you about your own research? And it's always interesting to hear their different responses.
I love those responses because when we're open to wonder, cool things happen.
Yeah. What's something that you're working on that you could use some help with?
Okay, I'm going to tell you my dream. Here it is. I think we need artificial intelligence badges for Girl Scouts because they have a wide reach, not only to girls, but into rural areas that don't have computer science education across the United States. I've worked with Girl Scouts National to develop that badge series. It's in their plan. I've worked with my local council. We've got pilot groups ready to test those badges in K through 12. I need funding for those badges. And I really think they could make a huge difference for girls in learning about AI. So I don't only need money. I would also like thought partners to do that work the best and well. I'm a lifetime Girl Scout and That's where my heart is. So if you have any connections with AI and scouting and you want to talk, I'm interested in working with Boy Scouts too, but I don't have as many contacts there. So
Do you have any questions for myself or for the field?
I'd love to know what learning theories or psychological theories might be beneficial in applying to CS education broadly, not just AI, and how we might best do that. I hope we could have a conversation about that, about ways that we can best educate. I think we don't really know yet all the best ways that we can employ technology in classrooms. And it'd be fun to talk about it with people who are interested in that.
My hunch is we could get there if people read more outside of the field. There is a tendency in the CS education space to kind of put some blinders on and think of CS as, oh, it's this relatively new field. And so therefore we kind of have to come up with approaches that are going to work well for us. So it's starting from within and then kind of working its way out, as opposed to looking at, well, what have they done in social studies? Or what have they done in science education? Or in the arts, and seeing the different frameworks and heuristics and theories that have informed educational philosophies elsewhere, and then trying to figure out, okay, well, how might we actually apply that in our space? So I've tried to do that with some of the podcast episodes, like the Unpacking Scholarship ones, where I'll point to well, here's what they're talking about in a different field, but I wish there was more of that in our space.
I'm glad you're bringing that.
Attempting. Are there any questions that I haven't asked that you'd like to discuss?
I think I'd like to talk about the future of work, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So if you remember in 2000, maybe you're old enough to remember 2000, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have them. If you had one, it maybe flipped open or was the size of a brick. And you were likely using it after 10 p.m. so that you could have free minutes. And if you texted, you pressed the number 2 an awful lot. So if you think about the shift that's happened in 20 years, we went from having computers at work to having computers in college to finally having computers that really did something at home for the majority of people. Then we had a revolution where we added phones that are actually like Star Trek communicators. They can do literally everything and you have the whole of human knowledge at your fingertips. And AI is a similar revolution. It is, however, invisible. So people are less aware of it as when phones came in our pockets. And the whole landscape of the types of jobs that are available are shifting as a result of AI. And so it's really important that we don't simply teach students to code. That's not really the goal, but that we think about the shifts in the future of work and that we cannot predict them. And so we need to empower students to reflect thoughtfully on the impacts of our technologies and the ways that we can regulate technologies to benefit humanity, and also to be prepared with skills like creativity and problem solving and lifelong learning that will allow them to be prepared for whatever job doesn't exist yet, while other roles that have traditionally been available are being automated. Just for one simple example, many of us started our careers at the local grocery store, and where there used to be 10 cashiers hired, now there's only one manning the self-checkout. And where we used to work at a fast food restaurant, many of those restaurants are having computers pour the drinks or process the orders and schedule very flexibly when people might work. And so I hope that the conversation will continue where we think about how we might best prepare students for the future of work. I do think that includes AI education, but I think it more generally requires us to stop thinking about math and science and social studies and English language arts, and requires us to become more holistic in our whole approach to how we consider the individuals who come into our schools every day.
Yeah, I really appreciate that response. I'm curious for you, are there any jobs where you really hope AI doesn't take it over? Like being an educator, working in education, or like a therapist or a masseuse? Do any stand out as, no, this should not ever be replaced by AI?
Well, I sure hope that my role as a mother, I'm not replaced by a robot anytime soon. I hope that we replace jobs that are dangerous and difficult with technologies that make those jobs safer. I think we have to also really thoughtfully consider jobs that are at high risk of automation, like a truck driver. Not only that our roads will be safer, which is often what you hear with AI, that the roads will be safer with self-driving cars, I do think that's true. But there are a lot of people who love their jobs as truck drivers. They have a culture and it should be honored, and that they are losing something by losing their jobs. And that we not only need to find them new employment, but meaningful employment. So I hope that we continue to have conversations holistically about all people as users of technology.
I forget where it was, but I had read something a few years back where they were shutting down like a coal mining plant. And what they ended up doing was providing CS education boot camps to anyone who was working there who was interested in it. So, hey, this job is no longer going to be available, but we are going to provide the education so that way you can learn and take on another job that might be of interest to you. Was a really interesting approach that I think provided some support, but that is a really important part about the culture. Because, like, I am inherently an educator. Like, whether it's playing Magic the Gathering with friends, like, I'll teach them, oh, here's some strategies you can use, or like, here's what mana is and why you need to know what that concept is, and whatever. Like, my wife will sometimes joke about how my education background just kind of shows in moments like those in my leisure and whatnot. So if all of a sudden it was like, well, this AI that we programmed is going to do a better job of teaching than you ever could in a million years, well, then that would definitely have a profound impact on me if I wasn't allowed to do something I was very passionate about.
Agreed. I also want to acknowledge that your example of being an educator is like a choice, but a lot of caregiving roles are not chosen. They're almost assumed. So when we have elder care, for example, it's often placed on the daughter of the family to do that elder care. And even if she's wanting to do that elder care, it may be a real strain for her career, for her family.
Yeah.
And if we can create technologies that mitigate some of the downsides and allow us to be our best selves in caregiving, for example, or in travel, and leave some of the harder parts to the technologies, that to me would be the best possible outcome. Now, I don't think our caregiving robots are potentially like coming right tomorrow, but I do think there's a need for ensuring that people are able to live their end of life with dignity, and perhaps there's a way for technology to help with that.
From my understanding, Japan's actually pretty forward on that. They have a lot of caregiving robots and whatnot, and it's fascinating the things that I have seen. So it'll be interesting to see if that makes its way over to the States in terms of like people wanting that.
I hope so, but I also think Japan has a culture that believes in the life force in all things, and so there's less of a hesitancy perhaps to embrace a robotic companion that's shaped like a seal or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm curious, are there any other topics that you'd like to discuss as well?
One more thing, which is if you're worried about self-driving cars, I know a lot of people are, and that the worst stories end up on the news occasionally, but robotic vehicles are far safer than humans. They don't get tired. They don't drink. They don't get distracted because there's a baby in the back seat. In thoughtful application, self-driving cars will save hundreds of thousands of lives a year in America. So if you've been hesitant, trust that that technology is going to save a lot of lives.
So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
If you're doing K-5, talk with John Pierce at CS is Elementary. If you're doing middle school or high school and you want to chat with me at AIEDU, I'm Charlotte at AIEDU.org. I would love to continue a conversation with anyone who wants to chat more about CS or AI in general.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this particular interview. If you'd be so kind, just ask that you share it with somebody else, because Charlotte had some awesome things to say. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.